Honored to introduce our speaker tonight, Susan Hasegawa. She's professor of history at San Diego City College, and she's the historian of the society that you just heard from. I understood she was born in Hawaii, but did almost all your higher end studies here in San Diego. That's right. And we're really looking forward to see what you have to say tonight. So welcome.
Thank you. Welcome and thank you for coming out. I know it's a busy Wednesday night, and for City College, we're finishing or in the middle of week 15, going into week 16, which is always very interesting with stressed out students and preparing essays and research papers. So I really appreciate you all coming out. Now, on my background a little bit, and I'm Japanese Filipino American from Maui. How many of you ever been to Maui? Yeah. Okay, so you arrive in Kahului Airport and you get on the Hana Highway and you drive for 2 hours. You'll hit my hometown of Hana. And so I'm just a country person, grew up on the ocean, right, very similar to La Jolla, except minus maybe, thousands of people. And so I did my graduate work at UCSD, Graduate School of International Relations and Pacific Studies, and just fell in love with San Diego and decided to stay and was fortunate enough to find employment. And so we're very fortunate to be here on behalf of the Japanese American Historical Society, but I'd also like to just acknowledge Linda Canada, because as an archivist and our president, she was instrumental in working with Michael in getting some of the artifacts here and working in collaboration for sharing our story. So thank you very much, Linda. And we're always looking for new partnerships, expanding, collaborating. And so, talk to Linda after the talk or myself, and we'd be happy to talk to you. Now, what I really like about the exhibit that Michael and the La Jolla Historical Society put together is it starts off with these very personal stories. And it talks about where people were at when Pearl Harbor happened. And you have these stories, and everybody can remember where they were at when Pearl Harbor happened. And one of the things when interviewing then Japanese Americans, they can remember very much where they were when Pearl Harbor happened, but also these other little snippets. And for some of the families, it wasn't Pearl Harbor, but what happened after Pearl Harbor that greatly changed their lives. And I'm going to get away from this just for a minute and take a look at a couple of videos. Because after Pearl Harbor, many of the fathers of Japanese Americans were picked up. Okay, and that is what some of them really remember, is where they were and what were they doing when their father was picked up and taken in by the FBI for questioning, and many of them were held. And several of them were sent to Crystal City, Texas. Okay, that's where one of the Department of Justice internment camps were, mainly for Issei, first-generation Japanese American men and their families, enemy aliens. They were deemed enemy aliens. And so this is Moro Tsuneyoshi, and he's about 11 years old. And his parents and his family, he was born and raised in Coronado. And so he's talking about then what happened to his father.
See, I was 10, and I celebrated my 11th, 12th, 13th, and 14th birthday in Canada. 11th birthday in Santa Anita, and the rest was in Poston. So most of the fathers in Coronado, I don't know, quite a few in San Diego probably, in fact, they were all taken away. But I don't know if that was right after the war started or not, but anyway, I was at the Takeshi's house when they took Mr. Takeshi away. I remember when they took him away, so they told me, you better go home, because this is also, Takeshi lived, like I said, by the golf course, and I had to pedal all the way to 4th close to North Island. Well, by the time I got home, my father was already gone. So I didn't see him again until mid-1945 in Boston. I do remember we could only take what we could carry. So I took my little shopping bag, and of course put my toys and candy and stuff in there. That was it. I know one thing, we were given a catalog. Was that Montgomery Ward Sears? Went there once together, and we were picked out our clothes. And I heard that we were going to, he said that we were going to go to a cold country, wherever it was, Heart Mountain or Manila. It's supposed to be cold. So we bought, they told us to buy, get these big heavy pea coats, jackets, and heavy boots and stuff. So we got off the train, it was 120 degrees outside Montreal. But I remember going through Parker. That was interesting, on the truck. And there were signs on the Parker windows that Japs keep out, so. I guess they knew we were coming. Well, I guess Camp 1, 2, and 3 were already there, so.
And so, Moto's parents and also father and Jumbo Takeshita, Akira Jumbo Takeshita, both of their fathers who were very much involved with the Buddhist temple. Their both fathers were picked up.
I'll never forget that day, God, I'll never forget it. Because we lived in Coronado. And my dad did gardening in Coronado, see. And then when the war broke out, and they put curfew on us. So all the people on the West Coast, you had to be in bed, and you had to be in the house by 8 o'clock, certain curfew. You had limited areas, how far we could travel, and everything. And I never forget it. And I remember when my dad was doing gardening, and Carl Clint was in the police department. And Carl Clint says, he was our neighbor, he came home, he says, hey, look, tell Dad, they're going to pick him up tomorrow. So I said, let's tell Sam, my brother Sam, that you go along with him, Sam, because you have to bring your car home too, You got to bring the tools, and they're going to pick up your dad at 7th Street, where they knew where he worked, his body worked. And so Sam said, okay, so don't you go to school now. Stay with your dad. And Sam said, okay. So that same day that they're going to pick him up, and he told Dad and he told Mom, we appreciate what Carl Clint did for us. And he told Mom to be careful, don't go out, too much at night, things like that. Sure enough, on 7th Street, and whatever, they came by, they picked up my dad, and Sam had to take the car home. And I was in school. I never saw my dad. And that's when they sent him to a special camp. All these Japanese people were sent. They call them Issei, first generation. They were sent to a special camp. And I never saw him after that. Because what camp we went into, from Santa Anita to Poston, my dad and them were in another camp. We were in Poston, and my dad was in New Mexico, someplace to camp, And then they released him to go to Poston where the family was. And that's when we saw my dad. And they came back. We were happy to see him, because I hadn't seen him for a while. And then they brought him into Camp Poston where he was. And that's how Dad stayed with us from then on.
And this was done as part of the Civil Liberties Public Education program from it. The impact of Pearl Harbor, got the United States into the war, but it also had then, huge impact on the Japanese and Japanese American community in the United States. And if we rewind a little bit and talk about settlement, because there were quite a few Japanese American families here in La Jolla, and also not just La Jolla, but Pacific Beach. And I know they're kind of like sisters, older sister, younger sister rivalries from what I understand. And so the Japanese Issei begin settling about the turn of the century, 1910, 1920s, and they start having families. And this is the Yamaguchi family. So Edith Yamaguchi and her father then Yataro. And he is then one of the farmers in Pacific Beach. And so many of the wives that came over were picture brides, meaning they exchanged pictures, wrote letters between the families, and then the wife came over. They got married in Japan and came over then through Angel Island. And in fact, my grandmother was also a picture bride. And that was always sort of interesting. And so now, as the Edith is the youngest, as they're growing up in Pacific Beach, this is really interesting. They're standing in front of a sign, the Yamaguchi family. They have 5 children. And the sign written in Japanese says, "Our ancestors are Japanese, we are Japanese Americans. For the honor of our ancestors and pride of America, let us hold hands, encourage each other, and study." It's kind of interesting because no one else can read the sign in Pacific Beach except a handful of Japanese families there. But they're making a very public statement. And here's these kids, 5 children in front, and Sam, one of the younger sons there, he's going to come back. Okay, he's going to come back, and we're going to come back to Sam a little later. And so you have a handful of families, farming families in Pacific Beach, but you also have a handful of Japanese American families in La Jolla. And I'm going to get this. And Hiomi Nakamura, who figures prominently in the display exhibit that Michael put together. And this is Hiomi and Phil Aker, sit outside the La Jolla Cafe about the 1920s. And Hiomi's father, Naojiro, he opened up a restaurant in the 1920s, and he had worked as a chef for one of the restaurants downtown, the San Diego University Club, and also for John D. Spreckles. And so they moved to La Jolla, and they actually buy a piece of property. Okay, they're renting, but they buy a piece of property, a lot that I believe Mrs. Nakamura still lives on. And at that time, in 1913 and also 1920, there were a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment and competition from Japanese farmers. So the state legislature passed 2 different anti-alien land laws that said aliens ineligible for citizenship, which Issei immigrants were not eligible for citizenship, could not purchase land. And so if you look at the records, the land was bought under Hiomi's name. And not only then in La Jolla, but you also had then some North County Japanese immigrant families, Japanese American families. And this is Shozo George Yasukochi. And he's standing in front of then chili fields in San Luis Rey. So there are about 15 to 20 families in the San Luis Rey Oceanside area. And they actually started a Japanese language school. And this is always sort of interesting because there's sort of the argument is, well, if they have a language school and, they're learning Japanese, which many actually Japanese kids, Nisei kids, did not really learn a whole lot. They just went and played. The argument was, well, they must be loyal to Japan. And this is sort of an interesting contradiction because on the one hand, the Issei could not become citizens, no matter how long they lived here. And there was a Supreme Court case that said, no, you cannot become a citizen. Issei people cannot become citizen. A handful of veterans from World War I do become citizens. But on the other hand, the children, if they got to return back to Japan, what are their children? And so they're still kind of unsure of what's going to happen, but the roots are definitely here in the United States, and specifically in California. Now, as the second generation are growing up, they're making statements of their own. And this is, if you notice, it says Pacific Beach, San Diego Japanese American Citizens League Picnic, JACL. And the Nisei are definitely making a statement. They went to elementary, middle school, high school here. Many of them are, going to then, what became San Diego State. Some are going to UC Berkeley, UCLA, and they are Americans. And they're even calling their club, which is also part of a national organization, Japanese American Citizen League. Okay, and this is then July 2nd, 1939. This is probably about the 4th of July picnic. Okay, and if you take a look, then this is Pacific Beach. I can't really put where in Pacific Beach, but definitely Pacific Beach looks very different now. And so on the eve of the war, you have a nice size then Nisei population. Nisei meaning second generation population. But if you notice, they're very young. In their 20s, in their teens, not very older people. And so when Pearl Harbor happens, this is then in 1940, on the eve of Pearl Harbor, this is part of then the Japanese American Community Directory. There was a publisher in Los Angeles that would collect, different addresses and names. And this is not quite totally accurate, but gives you a listing or an idea of then some of the families that lived in Del Mar, La Jolla, and also Pacific Beach. And so you can see they're kind of scattered around in this whole area up and down the coast. So when Pearl Harbor happens, a couple months later, in February 19th, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signs Executive Order 9066, which delegates to the military then that they can secure the West Coast in however they see fit. And military orders go out then to evacuate all persons of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast and then southern border of Arizona. And so Miss Breed, who was the children's librarian, very beloved children's librarian in the city of San Diego, she had befriended many of the Nisei children in downtown San Diego. And we think these are some of her pictures that she took that day of then everybody going down to the train depot. And Hiyomi, according to one of his oral histories then, they were also part of meeting at the train depot. They're under guard, military guard, and Miss Breed is handing out postcards, writing utensils, writing paper, stamps for the kids to write her letters. And the children do write her letters throughout. And you can see Dear Miss Breed, which then became a book, then how the children from, elementary school going into middle school, how they mature as they're writing. And they always start off with Dear Miss Breed and what's going on in their life. Okay, so Miss Breed then saw a number of her friends off, and this is Takeshi Paul and Hiroshi Kida. And they're waving, and then as both Jumbo Takeshita and Moto Tsuneyoshi said, from San Diego by train to Santa Anita Racetrack. Number of months in Santa Anita Racetrack, and then most of San Diegans ended up in Poston, Arizona. Now, if any of you are driving to Phoenix, you go up the 15, you take a right on the 10, and you're driving, and as you pass the Colorado River, there's a small turnoff right after you pass the Colorado River, and if you blink, you miss it. You take that turnoff, and you drive about 40 minutes north, okay, and you hit Parker. And when you hit Parker, you've gone too far, you've driven past Poston. So Poston was in the middle of the Colorado River Indian Tribal Reservation. Poston and Gila River are 2 out of 10 internment camps put on then these Indian reservations, and we'll come back to that a little later. Now, Miss Breed, tried very hard, stayed in touch with the kids, and also visited them in Santa Anita. And because people couldn't take any cameras, they were all a list of contraband that you couldn't take, basically only what you could carry, as Moto said. And so, we don't have a whole lot of pictures other than what the National Archives has. But Miss Breed saved this, and this is part of our archive. And if you take a look at it, Clara Breed, address, San Diego Public Library, and can you see how long she gets to meet with her kids? Half an hour, 30 minutes. And so one of the sort of diaries or letters talks about then Mrs. Breed's visit and how the kids are just overjoyed. But they're like 4 or 5 kids, from young kids to teenagers, and they only get half an hour with her. And it took her a number of weeks to just wrangle this pass and get through all the bureaucracy. And so from Santa Anita Racetrack, then the fathers, Jumbo Akira Takeshita's dad, he ends up in then Santa Fe, New Mexico, one of the Justice Department camps then that housed a lot of the Issei fathers. They're questioned, and some of them are moved around from different Justice Department camps. And when I talked to their children, Nisei, and I said, well, what happened? And they said, well, parents won't talk about it. Or they didn't say anything that happened. They just had to go along with it. And so Moro's dad eventually, and also Akira's dad, they joined him in Poston. And this is what Poston looks like. Somehow a gentleman named Paul Shintaku, and he became a professional photographer, he took a series of different photographs of people. Then they put it into yearbooks. Photographs of then the different barracks. And this is then one of the water towers. And one of dear Miss Breed's friends, he was a lot older. He was already a trained barber, and he lived in downtown. His name was Tetsu Hirasake. And he wrote to Miss Breed, and he's telling her about what he's doing, what's happening, and about what Poston's like. And he writes, then after Dear Miss Breed, the dust storm came during the 3rd week of January and lasted for 3 days. We had the coldest morning yet when the temperature dropped to 20 degrees. The whole day ice was on the ground, then it began to rain. It poured cloud dust after cloud dust for 3 days. The dust just turned into the stickiest mud I have ever seen. And so Moro's jacket that he actually bought to go to Manzanar actually came in handy for a couple months. And so this thick mud, people have to get very resourceful. And so the fathers and brothers go out and they scavenge whatever lumber they can find that are left over from the barracks. And they go and make geta. Have you ever seen geta, which are those wooden Japanese sandals? And that's what they walk around to, then to go to the communal showers, to go to the communal restrooms, especially with all the mud. One of the fathers, they say, in Poston, one of the things that marks Poston is a little different is this double roof line. There's a double roof then to keep more insulation, and the wind would come through and lift up one of the roofs, and the internees would scramble and then try to get lumber. Okay, lumber to then make dressers, all kinds of things they would scavenge. Okay, go out and get posts. Okay, posts, fence posts. And we have a couple of those dressers that people, now they call it sustainability and found materials. They were just trying to make the barracks more livable. And talking about the gardeners that Tripp talked about. Okay, so one of the things that the Bureau of Indian Affairs head, John Collier, had sort of thought about, he really lobbied for these internment camps to be put on Indian reservations for a number of reasons. One was to increase the population to get water rights. Second was to cultivate the land, make it irrigate, put in an irrigation system, make the land more fruitful. Okay, and that did happen. They started a farm. They started an adobe factory. And from the adobe factory, they built then the schools and different types of buildings. And one of the things that then, people had different jobs. There was a recreation. There were all kinds of lessons. There was a movie night. And what's interesting about the movie, going back again to found items, you had to bring your own chair. And so the movie was out in the open. People then made children's chairs so that their child could, have a little seat from, again, found materials. And we have a couple of those chairs. They're like little beach chairs that people have donated. And so Poston then becomes the 3rd largest city in Arizona with a maximum population of 18,000. Gila River that Hiomi Nakamura and his family was at was then about 13,400 people. So like any town you have all kinds of things going on. You have gambling, okay? You have people making, sake in, stills, homemade stills. There are gangs going around, these are the kind of thug-like people. And so, again, these are mini cities with all the good, the bad, and the ugly. And the authorities are saying, okay, the men can come together and irrigate this land. We have water from the Colorado River. And a lot of the fathers said, well, that's a good idea, but we're going to build a pool so our kids can learn how to swim. And they also then develop gardens. And you can tell this picture has been taken several years in to then Poston. And then Mrs. Shintaku is then the woman in the garden. Now, at Gila River, where the Nakamuras were at, again, they're slightly smaller population, I think a couple hours out of Phoenix, and life goes on, okay? And they try to get some type of recreation going. And Akira Shima, whose family owned one of the Japanese stores downtown, they end up in Gila River. And Akira Shima is a sumie artist. He's, a shodo writing, okay? And he is the poster maker. And so he would print up all these posters that would go out publicizing the different theater troupes, camp activities. And this is then for the Gila River Players Independence Day Variety Show. It's a 4th of July celebration. Okay. And people would then take these after they were put up and actually put them in their barrack. They're like wallpaper. And the Shima family saved every copy, one copy, and we also have that at our Historical Society. So it's wonderful that La Jolla has a Historical Society that can collect these things because it's just amazing and wonderful. So now, 1943, West Coast has been cleared. You have 10 different camps, Manzanar, Dooley Lake, Gila River, Poston, Hart Mountain, Topaz. Okay, so now the Justice Department is saying, we want people to go. We don't want, to have to feed, house, and take care of 110,000 plus people. And young people, again, because, the war is going on, young men have gone off to fight war, there is a labor shortage. So some seasonal migrant workers have already left to harvest beets in places like Idaho. They go out, harvest beets, come back to camp. But the camp officials say, okay, we want people to leave. We want you to go find some place, Denver, get a job outside of camp. Fill out this questionnaire, take this loyalty oath, and, find a job. You can find the job in Chicago, great, you can go. And so now comes the debate about what to do. And keep in mind, a lot of young people's schooling was then disruptive, and the Quakers step up. And there's a huge Quaker network that says we're going to try to get students then into some of the Midwestern Quaker schools. And that's what happens. And in fact, some young students get, even Alan Koba from Coronado. He's in high school. And he ends up, basically, Quaker family says, come on down. And he ends up, in of all places, in New Jersey, living with a Quaker family and graduates from high school. And his dad said, fine, okay, go ahead. And so now, in order to get out, though, you have to fill out a loyalty questionnaire. And 27 and 28 were kind of troublesome. It caused a lot of tension, conflict, anxiety. And question number 27 is, are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States in combat duty wherever ordered? 28, will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any or all attack by foreign or domestic forces, and forswear, oh my gosh, I have a typo, any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor or any other foreign government organization? You had two choices, yes or no. Yes or no. And keep in mind, 18,000 people, 3 camps, Camp 1, 2, and 3, and so they're little cities within themselves, and the rumor mill runs rampant. There's all kinds of people say this, people say that, even though you have an official Poston newspaper. And so it caused a lot of conflict because the Issei are saying, well, wait a minute. If I say yes, do I have to fight? If I say yes, then I'm renouncing my country, but I can't become a U.S. citizen. Will I become a countryless person? And so it's really implemented in a sort of hodgepodge fashion with not a clear understanding. And the young men who are filling this out, they're saying, if you fill this out, you're going to be part of the draft again. Initially, after Pearl Harbor, many of the people who were Japanese Americans already in the military, they were either let go, and now they're not qualified to serve, or some of them were sort of pushed aside to sort of do some kind of menial work. Okay, there were a couple that then continued to serve in whatever unit they were with, and so now, number of people say yes, yes. They end up in Denver, Minnesota, Minneapolis, Chicago, get a job, work in the candy factory, work in any type of job they can get, bookbinding. And that's why you do have some places like Japanese American population, of all places, Denver. And Governor Carr was actually welcoming of Japanese American families. And so this does cause a lot of problems though. And people who answered no, if they were eligible for the draft and they did not refuse to be inducted, they were called no boys. And they were prosecuted as draft dodgers, ended up in federal penitentiary. They were later pardoned. But if you said no, then they started shipping people to the no camp, Tule Lake. So if you ended up in Tule Lake, people say, I was at Tule Lake. You're like, oh, what did you do? Okay, so now then this whole different exchange goes on where the no people and the troublemakers get sent to Tule Lake, and the loyal people get sent out of Tule Lake. And so Tule Lake became a hotbed of a lot of tension and conflict. So San Diegans, many of them said yes, yes. Some of them volunteered, others waited for the draft, okay? And some of them ended up in Chicago. And this is then a young man, far right, let's see, Art Ozaki, Tom Sakaguchi, Art Ozaki, and Kacho Koba, Minoru Hatara. Okay, they're all catching up in 1944 in Chicago. And in one street, Hoyne Street, was where a lot of Japanese Americans lived. And the Nisei, many of them do get out. They say, I'm gone. Okay, this is, enough of Polston. And they some of them have a really good time at Hoyne Street, living in Hoyne Street. They're making money. And there's a really culture that then are away from their parents. Now, so 43, then, you have this exodus. Not only that, then the 442nd and the 100th Battalion are created. And the 442nd and 100th Battalion are an all-Nisei military unit. Okay, 442nd Regimental Combat Team and 100th Battalion. And you always have to mention the 100th Battalion because the 100th Battalion was the first one, and they're from Hawaii. Okay, the Hawaiians, initially are shut out. They're let go from the National Guard, but they really push, and they get the 100th Battalion started. So the 100th Battalion is first formed, and they are shipped out to Italy. When the 442nd Regimental Combat Team come along, and they actually meet up in Italy, the 100th becomes the first battalion of the 442nd. But Hawaiians always want to say, yes, the 100th Battalion. And if you ever talk to veterans, one of the things they'll always say is those Hawaiians. Okay, and if you notice the young man here, this is Sam Yamaguchi, the little kid that I showed you in the picture. Okay, he's 19 years old. He got drafted, and he's in Mississippi for basic training. And if you notice, he's wearing a lei, and this is a ribbon lei that many young men were given as they're leaving Hawaii. And so initially, there's a lot of tension between the Hawaiians that people call Buddha heads and the mainland Japanese Americans who are called kotonks. It's kind of derogatory in both, but everybody kind of laughs at it now. Okay, and the kotonks, according to the Hawaiians, they're called kotonks because when the coconut, they're sitting underneath the coconut tree and it hits them on the head, it's a hollow sound. Okay. And there are like this real animosity Because growing up in Hawaii, it's a very different feel when you make up 37+% of the population. When you are Asian, you're very dominant in terms of culture. And when in Hawaii, and they always say, well, those Japanese Nisei, those kotongs, they're always so quiet. Okay, the Hawaiians, they want to start fighting. Okay, and so any type of slip up. But there is this one episode where in one of the military installations, they actually get a couple busloads of then 442nd people of both Hawaiians and mainland Nisei, and they take them to one of the camps. Okay, and then the Hawaiians begin to realize how life is very different. Okay, and so it's not only the 442nd Combat Regimental Team, 100th Battalion, that serve in Europe, and they're one of the most highly decorated unit for its size and duration of service in the history of the U.S. military, but also the Military Intelligence Service, or MIS. Many Nisei, not all, okay, have actually learned something in Japanese language school. Okay, so they recruit these young Nisei, and they sent them to Minnesota, okay, Camp Savage, Minnesota. And this is then Toshio Abe. And Toshio Abe dropped out of college in 1940 when his father passed away. He was up at Berkeley, and he came back to help his mother out. He's drafted, and while he's in basic training, his family's evacuated. And because of his Japanese language skills, he's recruited into the Military Intelligence Service, and he at Camp Savage, Minnesota, and he ends up serving with Marauders in Burma. And so these Nisei interpreters, they're interrogating prisoners. They are then reading and translating then some of the documents that they get a hold of, and are very much credited with helping speed along the whole Pacific campaign. Now, back in Italy, and the 442nd, and if any of you have been to Venice, yes, St. Mark's Square, okay? And for many young men, this is the first time they traveled, first time they've been on an airplane. And this is Frank Wada from Spring Valley who volunteered. And he was a replacement in the 442nd, and he went from 2nd Scout to acting platoon sergeant in less than a month in the Rome-Arnold campaign in October of 1944. And what's really interesting with the 442nd is they are sent on a mission, and this has ties in with Texas. They are sent on basically a suicide mission to rescue a Texas battalion. And there are a couple of San Diegans in that, and a gentleman by the name of George Matsumoto. And he is telling his story before he passed away, and he's talking about, they're sent there, and they're saying, okay, we got to be done, and then they get the order to have a bayonet charge. Put in your bayonets, and you're going to have bayonet charge up the mountain. And he's going, what? Because the only time we use a bayonet was for like cooking. Okay, so they get the order, and they do it, and they suffer huge casualties, but they break the German lines and rescue the Texas battalion. And so the Texas battalion has made then the 442nd 100th Battalion like honorary Texans. And Frank Wada is actually then injured in one of those campaigns, but he made it to St. Mark's Square. Now, so 44, by the end of 44, the war has definitely turned in the Pacific. Okay, the U.S. is winning. Not only that, then the election of Franklin Roosevelt happens in November. So Roosevelt is elected again, and there are then 2 Supreme Court cases that come down. There are actually 4 Supreme Court cases that go all the way up to the Supreme Court challenging the internment and evacuation, and the Supreme Court sides on the side of the government. But one court case, Ex parte Endo, which was a test case that the ACLU took on, the justices said you cannot clearly hold a loyal individual. And Mitsui Endo was working for the state of California when the war broke out. She had taken a loyalty oath, as part of her job to get the position, she had brothers serving in the 442nd. And so in ex parte endo, they said a clearly loyal person you could not hold. That was just one person. Okay, but that opened the floodgates. And then again, the Justice Department, they didn't want to continue housing thousands and thousands of people and confining thousands and thousands of people. So beginning in 1945, then the West Coast opened up again. And January 1st, people could start returning to the West Coast. And now comes the decision, because many of the Issei families, fathers and wives in their 40s or 50s, they're going to say, what are they going to do now? Do they go east? Do they come back to the West Coast? It has changed. What kind of reception are they going to find? And as they're coming back to the West Coast in San Diego, then they are moving, just finding any type of housing. And if you had a relative in the military, you end up in some of the defense housing, frontier homes. Okay, some of the Linda Vista housing. But Japanese Americans do return to San Diego. And by 1950, the population is about the same as in 1940, about 2,000. Hiyomi Nakamura comes back, okay? And he builds a house on the lot he owns. Started then, or eventually ran then in laboratories, Thomson Laboratories, okay? Others like the Nakagawa family, who was farmers in La Jolla, they had to get rid of their farm. And George Nakagawa wanted to come back, and he ended up then in North County farming, started growing carnations. And so the Japanese Americans then restart their churches. This is a Japanese Christian church, and they're located in downtown, about 4 or 5 blocks away from City College. They restart the Buddhist temple. Many, if they own their home, a lot of homeowners were actually able to hold on to their homes. Okay. Again, not everybody, most people didn't own their homes. They were tenants. And so they are then, just like everybody else, having a housing shortage, scrambling for work, and they try to restart then the way they were before the war. And the major impact is in downtown San Diego. In 1940, there were about 30 plus Japanese immigrant and Japanese American businesses. Okay, only a handful come back after the war. It definitely disperses the community, okay, but you still have community centers like the churches. You still have then the community picnics. Japanese American Citizens Leagues decide to start again. And the Nisei who are coming of age, served in the military, they're coming back and they're starting families, just like the baby boom. Okay, they're having families. And it's not until the 80s, along with this movement called redress. It's the sansei who start asking, what happened during the war? I heard something in school. Why didn't you tell me? You were in camp. Okay, and the Nisei are very reluctant to talk about it. The Issei, the Issei don't talk. I know my grandparents were basically Issei. Okay, they say study hard. That's it. Then they say get married. That's it. Then they say we're the grandchildren or great grandchildren. That's it. Okay, but the Nisei, they start reflecting back, and the sansei are then asking these questions. And sansei lawyers are getting involved in the Fred Korematsu case, Gordon Hirabayashi case, the case that went to the Supreme Court. Okay, getting that retried. And you have then in 1988, President Ronald Reagan signs, and Congress passes then H.R. 442. Well, the opposite way around. Okay, Congress passes and President Reagan signs. And that offers an official government apology and $20,000. Okay, and that's very controversial also. And now, you see, towards into the 90s, the Nisei start getting back together again. And what's interesting is within camp, people growing up together and people of a certain age, younger children, they form these lifelong bonds. And you talk to different people, and camp impacts them very differently. For adults, incredibly traumatic. They lose everything. For younger kids, it was fun. Okay, because they could hang out with their friends. They finally got school started, but they did have a lot of fun. Okay, so it depends on what age they were at. And also, sometimes when you talk to people, what is even more traumatic is then coming back to school. Okay, am I going to be treated? How am I going to, get back into school again? And some people have very heartwarming reunions with people, childhood classmates before camp. Others have a lot of difficulty. But in the 1990s, Poston internees, they start having reunions and other camps also do. So this is a 1991 Poston 3 reunion held in San Diego. And Miss Breed is to the right, and her letter writers, Catherine Hasegawa and Luis Ogawa. And they were two of the letter writers that wrote Dear Miss Breed, and she saved these letters that was then put into a book and a play. And that's what I really like about coming to the La Jolla Historical Society, because you have this wonderful organization that is then continuing to preserve the stories of World War II. It's wonderful that you went out and worked with students to then create oral histories, okay? And Poston internees, then working with the Colorado River Indian tribe in 1992, dedicated a monument. And the monument then is right on the side of the road, but then marking then the 18,000 people that spent 2 to 3 years then at Poston in the Colorado River Indian Tribal Reservation. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes.
At what point was the citizenship policy changed so that when you take it to our citizens?
1952, the Walter McCarran Act, where Issei, or previously people ineligible for citizenship, could become naturalized citizens. And, there are a number of Issei who do become citizens. Yeah. And, they study for the exam, yes.
And also, what were these two Supreme Court decisions that you're talking about?
Okay. There were Gordon Hirabayashi, Minya Sui, and Fred Korematsu. Gordon Hirabayashi was a University of Washington student who was a Quaker. And when, curfew happened, he says, well, I'm a Quaker. That doesn't pertain to me. And he and Minya Sui also broke curfew. So they're put in jail. And this goes all to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court sided on the side of the government. Didn't really talk about internment or locking people up, but mainly sided on the fact that the government, during times of war, could take measures in order to protect themselves. Now, Fred Korematsu, he is in San Francisco, and he's a welder. And internment happens in San Francisco, everybody leaves, but Fred decides, no, I'm going to stay with my Caucasian girlfriend. He is then reported on, and he gets hauled into jail. And his case, because it has specifically to do with internment, the Supreme Court decides, again, very loosely, not on the specifics, but basically on the side of the government. And so in the Mitsui Endo's case, which was the fourth case, again, they finally decided that a clearly loyal person could not, be detained. So in the 1990s, and I love this, UCSD historian, constitutional lawyer, historian, Peter Irons, he, working along with other scholars, then dug up information that the government lawyers lied, and dug up information that they withheld information to the court. And so those three cases, and the lawyers, the Isansei lawyers, along with Peter Irons, are then trying to figure out what to do. Do they take it all the way to the Supreme Court where they get one shot at the apple? Or do they go to the lower courts? And they decide on the lower courts. So now, in this case, one of the plaintiffs dies, so he's out. But Korematsu and Hirabayashi, okay, they get their basically vacated. It does not strike down internment. It does not strike down the previous Supreme Court cases, but their cases are vacated. It isn't quite what the lawyers wanted, But the judge then wrote in, basically excoriating the U.S. government for doing what it did do. So the Supreme Court, in the courts, the support of internment still stands. President, I want to say Bush or Ford, they actually repealed Presidential Order 9066, but it still stands in the courts. Okay, and so there's a constitutional debate. Can it happen again? Then there's the whole debate, and constitutional scholars weigh in. Okay. Yes.
Your talk is very informative. I totally appreciate. I just wonder, as Japanese Americans, whatever, and the people suffered during the internment camp, which I totally sympathize. And how do, let's say, Japanese American think about the way the American government, do the formally apologize to Japanese American because what they suffer, and compare with the Japanese government toward the Chinese civilian victims during World War II. They have not really formalized to apologize. How do you guys think about? I just wonder, are there Japanese American, especially those who have been to internment camp and they have to be apologized, what their attitude toward the Japanese government?
I've traveled in China, and I've spent a year in Japan, and I think the Japanese government should do more, towards the people. And I think, and from my point of view, and I teach Asian studies, Asian history as well as Asian American history, and the Japanese government itself has a new generation that the current politicians, they didn't live through the war, and so I think the Japanese government itself could do a lot more. I've been to the Nanjing Museum, the Rape of Nanjing Museum, and it's horrible, devastating. Read Iris Chang's book. And so I think there are still things that the Japanese government could do, and within the Japanese school books, their history books, that could be worked on. But I'm not a Japanese citizen.
I know.
Yeah, okay. I can work on American textbooks.
I
Okay,
think the
yeah.
world is becoming so small. All the information are so easily distributed all over. And if, if American people really raise up the issue and give pressure on the Japanese government, they will do something.
Actually, I think if the Chinese government, Korean government, Filipino government, that is going to be more pressure.
They do.
Okay.
They do.
So,
but U.S. government still is the one who is in the middle.
and I think the U.S. government right now is up to their neck with the gentleman named Cheng. And what's going to happen next, whether he's going to be able to go to NYU Law School as a visiting scholar. And so that's the front and center. But I definitely agree with you, the Japanese textbooks. And when I talk about Asian history, I'll have Japanese students who have been through high school and even some college. And when I talk about what the Japanese have done, Japanese military had done in Manchuria, in Korea, in Shanghai, Nanjing, they'll come up to me afterwards and say, I've never heard of this. And I said, well, come on into my office and let's discuss it. So I agree. But I also agree that China, Korea, Taiwan have to do more. They have to take the lead. Yes.
Yeah. Just pointing out the Yokohama Museum, the Japanese American diaspora.
Okay, and the Japanese government has actually funded in Yokohama an overseas Japanese museum that looks at then the Japanese diaspora, not just in the United States, but also in Brazil, in Peru. And so I think there are measures to globalize, but I think the Japanese government still could do a lot more. Other questions? Yes.
Assuming you've been to Poston,
Yes.
is there anything other than the monument that remains there of
Okay.
the camp?
There was an auditorium that was there that the Colorado River Indian Tribe and the Poston Committee for Preservation had worked really hard to try to preserve, but unfortunately there was an arson fire there. And so What the committee has tried to do is, what's interesting is as the internees are leaving, the Bureau of Indian Affairs are moving in Hopis for colonization. And that is another whole story because the Hopis don't want to move there. Okay, they're being forced by the U.S. government. And you know, I talked to some of the Colorado River Indian tribal elders, and they feel real kinship because, you know, you kind of get moved around by you know, the U.S. government. And so they end up living in some of the barracks. Okay, now there is alfalfa grown in those areas, but a couple of the barracks then were also moved into Poston themselves and used as, you know, storage, barn-like things, structures. And so there are a couple, or at least one in Poston that, oh, Parker, thank you, Parker, that the committee is trying to save and move back. The Japanese American National Museum was very successful in moving back a barrack from Hart Mountain, and it is actually built into the structure or preserved into the structure of the second floor of the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. And so and it's also sort of interesting because the Colorado River Indian tribe are a sovereign nation. So anything that happens on their reservation will have to go through the tribal council. They have been very open and very supportive, but at the same time, anytime they're going to take any type of money or some type of preservation funds, it's going to have to, the federal government says, well, now you're taking money. And so it does get into a number of different issues where there's an added layer of bureaucracy, not bureaucracy, added layer of interestingness with the tribal Indian reservations because they are sovereign nations. Unlike, say, Manzanar, which is a national park, unlike Hart Mountain, and there's one place that they I think allocated a historic monument. Okay, so there's this movement then to preserve, and again, that's what I love about the La Jolla Historical Society is you are into preservation, documenting stories, and that's what we are all about. Preserving stories, documenting stories, and ensuring that, you know, the next generation will hear about it. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yes.
One more.
This is not a question, but in Seattle, there's an Asian museum that I've visited a couple of times.
Is it the Wing Luke?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. I love them.
They have a wonderful exhibition of this period.
Yeah, and what I like about the Wing Luke is they are multicultural. And they keep coming up with new ways, and also I think involve a lot of arts organizations. And so they are incredibly dynamic, and what they do on a shoestring budget is totally admirable. And so, yes, if you get up to Seattle, the Wing Luke Museum, I would definitely take that in. And I know a couple people have been recently to Manzanar. Manzanar has and I haven't been up there yet, I'm ashamed to say I will get up there, okay? New interpretive center, and the Manzanar pilgrimage just took place last week. I was supposed to go up with a former student, but things kind of fell through. Okay, again, thank you very much for coming. I think there are refreshments, and you know, if you want to continue talking, I'd be happy to have, and also Linda Canada, she is my partner in crime. We are weekend warriors over at our archive in Ronson Road.
Before you go, we have a membership for you into the La Jolla Historical Society.
Wonderful.
So welcome. And we spare no expense. And so when you're working late at night,
I love
you have
coffee
your tea.
cups. I love
Okay?
these.
So
Thank
you'll
you very
remember
much.
us. And thank you very much.
Thank you. And again, thank you for coming out.